In 2022, Volkswagen gave us the Mark 8 GTI, and we all knew what was coming after the Mark 8. It became inevitably clear to us right away that this car would be the final combustion engine GTI ever made. For now. It seems like things might be changing over in Europe to keep that from happening. But for the moment, we have to operate under the assumption that this will be the last generation of gas-powered GTI. And this is a crucial moment. VW unveiled this past year and is bringing into the US, hopefully here in a few months, the Mark 8.5 GTI. And this is why it cannot fail. It is a make or break moment for VW. Let's start our story with the Mark 7. The Mark 7 launched to much fanfare in 2015, or earlier by a couple years, in Europe, as things tend to go with GTIs and Golf Rs and all that stuff. But the car launched to much fanfare. This model was touted as being one of the best generations of GTI of all time. It brought many people back to the brand who may have owned them before. People may have owned Mark 3s and Mark 4s and were like, oh, this one's like really, really good. They've really ironed out a lot of the issues. Let's go back and try this again, and fell in love with them. Me included. As someone who was raised in a VW household, this brand means a lot to me, obviously. This car was the first GTI that I had looked at in years and been like, I really want that one. Not to say that I don't love all GTIs equally, but the Mark 7 was really the one that I was like, man, I want to work hard to get one of those. Instead of just being like, oh, that's a car I'll strongly consider when I'm going to buy a car. And I fell in love with it, obviously. And I've obviously fallen even harder for the brand I was raised with. So, yeah, the Mark 7, very special car to me. But in 2022, we got the Mark 8, as we all know. And it is an evolution, I think, in many ways, and a downgrade in one way specifically. The Mark 8 looks really good. In my opinion, objectively, it looks a little bit better than the Mark 7. I know that is a hot take, and I'll probably burn at the stake for that. But as a Mark 7 owner, I think the Mark 8 is an upgrade visually from the Mark 7. And apparently, as someone who hasn't driven one yet, but who would love to drive one, if there's anyone wanting to do a feature film with me on my channel, lives in the metro Atlanta area who has a Mark 8, reach out. I've heard the driving experience is so much better than the Mark 7. Which is interesting because the Mark 7 is one of the better driving front-wheel drive cars on sale today. At least it was during its production run. So to hear people go with the Mark 8 and say it's even better than the Mark 7 was, is pretty impressive. But that is where the praise kind of stops with the Mark 8 in many journalists' eyes. Of course, I'm talking from a journalist perspective. I've never been in a Mark 8. I've never driven one. I've never even ridden one. I don't know anybody who has one other than just some internet friends that I haven't met in person yet. So the quality of the interior. I think that is obviously where a lot of people want to go, and they want to start fights over, oh, but the Mark 8 has so much more cheap plastic and the touch capacitive buttons, and you have to go through 6 menus to get the ESC controls, which is annoying. But I feel like that is just a crucial misstep of VW corporate. I do think it is still a good looking interior. I still see Mark 8 interiors all the time. I'm like, man, that's a pretty snazzy looking interior. And it just definitely looks better than it apparently feels. Like I said, I've never been in one. I'm not going to speak and say with certainty that it is the worst interior of all time because I myself have not touched one. I have never felt the leather on the steering wheel. I've never touched a door card in a Mark 8. But from what I hear, that's the common complaints is the interior in the Mark 8. But now we've got the Mark 8.5. It's got some new stuff. We've got ChatGPT integrated into it, into this giant center screen, which, hot take, I actually kind of like. It reminds me of Audi's, and I really like the B9's interior and how they've kind of done that same kind of floating screen look. And I think it's a very nice look. Am I a big fan of having giant screens in my cars? No, I prefer a more flush look. It's part of the reason why I love the Mark 7's interior so much. But I'm not opposed to the floating screen either. And probably the biggest upgrade, in my opinion, for the interior is the return of the physical buttons. I know I personally think the hate on the touch capacitive stuff is overdone. I think people just hate it just to hate. But also there are some people who are probably rightly justified in their reasons for disliking it. For me personally, I think going so far as to say it's like the worst thing to ever happen to VW is a little bit of a stretch. There are much worse things. You just have to look back in the company's history to see that. But the Mark 8.5 returned regular buttons to the GTI. The R is keeping with the touch capacitive, but they've changed some of the settings on it, so hopefully it's not going to be so annoying. Because it does look premium. It's just, in practice, wasn't very good, is what the journalists have been saying. So I am happy to see those things, honestly, but obviously we have to talk about the elephant in the room when it comes to the Mark 8.5, and that is the lack of a manual transmission. Now, as the DSG owner myself, and as someone who does enjoy driving manual, I'm personally not too butthurt over this. I think it's just how the times are going nowadays, but I would still love to see the option. I think it is kind of a misstep that the transmission is entirely gone, but if you look at it from a business perspective, and as someone who, dabbles a lot in learning law and learning, how companies operate with, supply and demand, and all sorts of other little weird topics that I tend to find myself obsessed with. It makes sense why it's gone. It just doesn't sell. All these people clamor for returning the manual, save the manual, but when a car is offered a manual, no one buys it. So I see totally why that transmission is gone. It is an absolute shame. Trust me, I love the manual transmissions in VWs I have driven. I've driven a couple of manual cars over the years, and one of which was a Mark 6 GTI with a manual that belongs to one of my best friends. And I loved it. Sure, the shifter could be better. It's no S2000, it's no Civic Type R shifter, but it is still incredible for what it is, which is a Golf. But I do think that the lack of a manual in the Mark 8.5 is a bit of a misstep. However, I do feel like even with the original Mark 8, it was an afterthought. I mean, the center console was completely different if you had a manual Mark 8. You had the Mark 7's ignition button, for crying out loud. They didn't even bother to keep the same start button from the DSG cars. Like, it's completely different. They really went out of their way to make you feel like the manual was kind of an afterthought. But it was still good. From what I hear, it was actually an improvement over the Mark 7's transmission, which is nice. But I do feel like it was completely a afterthought for the Mark 8, and I feel like that was kind of when I knew personally the manual's days were numbered. And when the 380 was unveiled, of course, I made a video on the 380 edition thinking it was some super special, like, American club sport, Porsche RS America style, but it turned out to just be a freaking package for the manual as like a final hoorah. So I think that is definitely one of the biggest missteps for the Mark 8.5. But why I think it's make or break is because of that looming electrification that the GTI is facing. While there have been plenty of rumors the last year or so that, the car is not going to go full electric, there's going to be an electric ID9 model, and the Golf is going to remain combustion powered forever. I don't see that a possibility. I think with all the emissions regulations in Europe especially, that we will not see another combustion engine Golf after this one. This is it. So they need to come out swinging. This needs to be the model that solidifies the GTI's legacy for decades to come. There needs to be a new Club Sport S. We had never got a true Club Sport S replacement. If you're familiar with the Club Sport S, it's a European-only model of the Mark 7 that came out around 2016-2017. And it claimed the front-wheel drive Nürburgring record for many years, I believe, until the Civic Type R finally stole it from it. But it was a special GTI that took effectively the idea of a GT3 RS and just made it a Golf. You had no back seats, you had no air conditioning. It was manual transmission only, which I know ruins the comparison to the Porsche, but its whole purpose was just to be faster on a track. It had the Golf R's variant of the E888 Gen 3 in it, with the IS-38 strapped in from the beginning. It was a legendary car and one of my personal favorite VW models of all time, bias included as a Mark 7 owner. But we need another version of that. I think that alone will get the GTI Mark 8.5's legacy sealed. The fact that we would have another hardcore Civic Type R level front-wheel drive GTI model would be legendary. And it doesn't need to be flashy. It doesn't need to have a ton of aero. It needs to be functional. I think that is the main thing. It needs to have good suspension, good tire options, less weight, and some level of aero to help keep the thing stuck to the road. That alone, I think, would be enough for the Mark 8.5 to fully surpass its rivals and cement its legacy as the last best GTI, not as, the blunder that came after the Mark 7, which is what plenty of journalists seem to think about the Mark 8, that the Mark 8 was just a blunder compared to the Mark 7. But that is that for now. I think another way the Mark 8.5 could seal its legacy and not be a failure is going to be with the aftermarket support, obviously. The Mark 7 and the Mark 8 both have seen this a lot. But I think as well from the manufacturer side, special parts from VW, stuff like Club Sport suspension being offered readily available in the US through dealership networks versus having to source them from overseas through aftermarket companies and having to pay extraordinarily large import costs in some cases if you're buying on stuff like eBay. it's really hard to get Club Sport parts here in the US, especially for Mark 8 owners. Mark 7 owners, it's a little bit easier. Mark 8 owners, it's not common from what I've seen. I don't see a lot of people running Club Sport mufflers or Club Sport suspension. Club Sport cosmetic parts, yes, but you know, a lot of the other Club Sport bits are less common versus just going out and buying a Borla exhaust off the shelf if you go to like BMP or Eurotuning or whatever in person. That, I think, is going to be a crucial thing VW needs to do. They need to have their own level of aftermarket support that rivals companies like BMP and Eurotuning and stuff like that. I'm not saying they need to go and sell GFB parts or Eibach or Bilstein. They need to build parts that are up to that same level that are directly from VW, come with the same guarantee and the same like warranty stuff that VW offers on their cars. Effectively make it to where you could technically go to a dealership, buy a Mark 8.5 GTI, drive it to the service department, and have it converted into a Club Sport right there on the spot if they're not going to sell a full fat Club Sport model here. I think that is also important, that a Club Sport needs to come to the US. The fans have been clamoring for it for years, myself included. This has been something we've all wanted, is a Club Sport in the United States, because we only get the normal GTI here. We only get the S, SE, and Autobahn. We don't get the Club Sport. We never got the Club Sport S when it was in production. We only get the normal GTI and the Golf R. We don't get that really sporty, super more track-focused variant that sits in the middle between the GTI and the Golf R. Now, the Golf R for the Mark 8.5 is getting a Euro-style package, or whatever it's called, which is going to have a lighter weight setup. It's going to have a titanium exhaust from the get-go. It's going to have lighter seats. But and I think maybe some suspension bits. I don't remember off the top of my head. But stuff like that. And I think that is good. I think that's going to really help the Golf R's legacy here. But for the GTI, we have no evidence that the Club Sport's coming to the US. There's not been a whole lot of talk about the Mark 8.5's US, debut. But I think that alone will cement its legacy here if we get the Club Sport model or a Club Sport S model specifically to really give people with Civic Type R's run for their money, not just in a straight line, as VWs have been proven to do for the last decade since the E-A-Triple Gen 3 was introduced, but on the corners as well, because that is unfortunately where the GTI's similarities to the Type R stop, is in the corners, unless you spend a lot of money like I did in aftermarket parts, which actually made it extremely sporty to drive, more so than it already was. It needs to be OEM level work. I think that is extremely important. The next thing I think they need to do is get back into motorsport. And VW has been doing this to an extent. They raced the 24 Hours of Nürburgring last year with a modified GTI TCR car that was actually the scrapped TCR car that was covered, I believe, on Haggerty a couple years ago. They raced it last year under a new name, the GTI 24 or something like that, and won its class. And this year they're repeating the feat again with another Mark 8 race car. So we are starting to see them come back into motorsport. They've run their Cupra brand over here in the United States in IMSA with the Cupra, the Leon Cupra touring cars, stuff like that. But I think if VW wants to get the GTI back to its legendary status in the US, as fandom in the brand has been dying down over the years, I think bringing the GTI TCR race car back into competition is going to be the move. I think they need to bring it back. Sure, that would mean TCR grids and IMSA would be mostly fielded by VW group cars, being the Cupra, the Audi, and theoretically a GTI TCR. But I still think that if they want to cement that brand legacy one more time and really, really give the GTI the fanfare it deserves, that's what needs to happen. But those are my takes for how the Mark 8.5 needs to be a success and not be a failure. If you guys have other takes that you guys think would be beneficial to keep this car on the road and, keep the fanfare up and keep it from being a failure, what recommendations do you have for VW? What do you think that they need to do to really cement the Mark 8.5 and make it the best GTI that it can be? Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys later with a new part installed in my car. Have a great day.